next we have Jasmine, who will be joining me. So I will give a little bit of an introduction to Jasmine, but she is one of my biggest role models. I read her book, Other Words for Home, which I highly recommend, and I was just so struck by the story, which was just so powerful. So I'll just be sharing a little bit about her first and then asking her to tell her story. So Jasmine Warga is a writer from Cincinnati, Ohio, and she currently resides in the Chicago area. She is the John Newbery Honor award-winning author of Other Words for Home, which was also awarded a Walter Honor, a Charlotte Huck Honor, and Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Prize Honor. And so it is my absolute honor, actually, to speak with you today, Jasmine, and I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your story and what got you into writing in the first place.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me be part of this event. I'm so inspired by the other speakers that you have in this lineup, and it's such a fantastic event for a cause that's very close to my own heart, too. So in terms of what got me into writing, I think I've always been a storyteller. I come from a family of storytellers, and I remember having a distinct moment in first grade when I put together the idea that it was a job that some people had to write stories. And I think that because
So she seems to have dropped a little bit and frozen on my end, which is okay. But I actually totally agree with what Jasmine was saying about storytelling. For me, I think my storytelling comes more.
A little bit nervous that the internet connection was going in and out. I'm not sure if that's happening on all platforms or just on my platform.
Yeah, I saw you freeze. Maybe you can take a second and reload the page, if that's okay. So as I was saying, yeah, I think it's been really amazing for me to use my voice and my storytelling skills to connect with others. I think connection is ever more important as we're all stuck at home. And I think one of the things that has been a common theme throughout my life has been storytelling, as Jasmine was saying. Stories play a huge, huge role in encouraging people from different backgrounds, from all corners of the world, from different ethnicities, et cetera, to come together in solidarity with each other. And I think that's why I really wanted to make sure that we had a number of authors joining us today. And so Jasmine is back on, so she could share a little bit more about her storytelling.
Where I got cut off, I noticed that something didn't seem right. Yeah, so I was saying that I've always wanted to be a writer. I come from a family of storytellers. But somewhere along the way, I started to realize that I think I internalized this idea that I wasn't seeing a lot of stories about people like me or people like my family. And I internalized this idea that people like me didn't really become storytellers. And then on the same, I guess, in the same realm of that sort of societal pressure, my father, who's an immigrant, very much wanted me to be a doctor. And sort of the career choice was what type of doctor you wanted to be. And it's not at all because he didn't want me to follow my dreams or be happy, but there's this idea of security that's really, really important, I think, in immigrant communities, and it makes sense. And so he didn't know anyone who's a writer. And I think that when you don't see that, it's hard to dream that for your children. And so I had kind of a windy road to being a writer. I went to university, and I didn't study creative writing, again, because I didn't think that could really be my job. But it was this dream that I had that sort of would not let go of its teeth in me. And so I eventually took a big risk, and after college, I applied to an MFA program. And it's through that MFA program that I learned a lot of things about writing in that program, but I think most of all, I learned to take myself seriously as a writer. And I think sometimes that's what education does. It's not only the value of what it teaches us, especially as women, and especially when you're a young woman, but it gives you that sense of value in yourself and to take yourself seriously. And so I think that's such an important part of my becoming a writer.
Yeah, how do you think young girls can kind of build that self-confidence and build the notion that they do have value and that their story does deserve to be heard? Because I think that's something many of us struggle with, right? We just think that nobody wants to listen to what we've done or where our parents came from or where we come from. But I think what you're saying right now is that that's really important, and that's kind of what helped you find your writing voice.
Yeah, I think reclaiming that space and challenging the narrative of what types of stories are worth telling.
Mhm,
And I think that even myself, I've had to be surprised. When I was writing Other Words for Home, I had wrongly thought of it as such a niche story. I was
mhm,
so worried that it would have a very, very limited audience because I was like, who's going to be interested in this book? And I think because I had been taught to sell my own stories short and to think of them as being small because that is the messaging that I internalized. So for young women, especially young women who come from minority backgrounds, the biggest thing that I want to encourage them to do is to understand that your story has power and your story is going to resonate with people even outside of your community. And it's an important story that needs to be told. And finding your own value and learning how to own your space and take up space. And that's a wonderful thing. I think sometimes too, we internalize and learn how to make ourselves small. That's the kind of education that we have as women, and especially women from minority backgrounds. And so, reclaiming that and
mhm.
unlearning that behavior is a huge part, I think, of an important education.
So personally and professionally, how did you go about like reclaiming that space and understanding that your story did have value and that Other Words for Home was a story that deserved to be told not only for the niche audience that I think you originally had in mind, but also for, I think, kids all over the world who just wanted to hear a story about a young girl who struggles moving between two different countries and really has a very, I think, human and relatable experience.
Yeah, so I think that um, I was had these other mentor talks and I watched other fabulous women, especially women of color writers who had books that broke out, that resonated with audiences beyond those marginalized communities. And from looking at those books, in particular, I'm thinking of Jacqueline Woodson, who wrote this book called Brown Girl Dreaming, which is a gorgeous memoir in verse. There's another book that I used a lot, I was looking at a lot, called Inside Out and Back Again,
Mhm.
which is a story of a young girl from Vietnam who comes over. And I was seeing these books and they were having this tremendous response. And I was having a tremendous response to them. And I'm obviously clearly not from those communities. And I think seeing that and learning that and watching the road that they had paved
Mhm.
for me was so integral to my own willingness to then write those stories. Because when I first started in my MFA, I was writing really sort of bland
Mhm.
stories that I'd written myself and my family and community out of. And I had a teacher in my MFA program who said to me, what, what about the story do you like? Why are you telling this story? And I was like, oh, because I thought that was the story like we were supposed that's the story
Mhm.
that I'd seen on shelves. And so I think there's a certain amount of like self awakening that happens for young women, and I'm hoping that for young women who are watching this that light might start to go off. So for me it was a collection of different things. It was seeing other women of color who
Mhm.
had done amazing things in the publishing space and being really inspired by that. And then having some teachers who are saying your voice is important as it is. You don't have to mask it. You don't have to cover that up. That
Mhm.
is what you can bring to the table. And so I think reclaiming my voice was a really important part of my journey as a writer.
Thank you. No, that's wonderful. And I know you have two little girls, right?
Yes,
So
yeah, I
what
do.
yeah, so how have you been kind of like encouraging them to use their own voices? I don't know how old they are,
Yeah.
but I think you could kind of start whenever, right? And I think with girls especially, it's so important to make them feel valued and also obviously make sure that they value their education and feel confident in knowing that their knowledge and their competencies matter.
Yeah, no, for sure. So they're 3 and 4, so they're very young, but I'm very intentional about the types of books that I bring into
Mhm.
our house, the types of stories that they're growing up with,
Mhm.
in terms of wanting them to have media that represents the world that we actually live in and makes them feel empowered to use their voice and also to use their voice to stand up for injustices because my girls are going to have a lot of privileges that other children in this country don't have. And I want them to be aware of that too. I want them to be aware of their power and also of their privilege. And I think that's a really powerful thing to understand at a really young age. And so we have those conversations already. We have conversations in our family about race, about socioeconomic differences, because I think that sometimes people underestimate children. That's something
Mhm.
I feel also is one of passions of mine writing for young people, is that children are really complex and they can have these conversations and they have these questions. And when we deny them the ability to talk about that, these questions just fester. It doesn't make them go away. And so, yeah, I just want to encourage my girls to be big thinkers and to challenge narratives that they're given, because I think that's something I didn't understand so much as a young person. I sort of took for granted the narrative that was told to me. And so I think the more women we can raise to be kind of narrative challengers and narrative breakers, be great.
That's awesome. I absolutely love that. And I think that's definitely been a theme throughout the day thus far. And I'm sure it's going to be a theme going forward. But the role of youth in challenging the current status quo and ensuring not only that girls around the world are educated, but I think also that many of the issues we talk about on a daily basis are solved. And I think that's one of the things that has inspired me so much from your story, but also the stories of so many others, is how the youth voice can play a role in promoting some of these solutions. And so I'd love for you to to talk a little bit about like maybe some of your work going forward and how you hope that advocates for youth and helps empower youth themselves.
Yeah, so my next book is going to come out next May, and it's called The
Mhm.
Shape of Thunder, and it deals with sort of the trauma of mass gun violence in America.
Mhm.
And I really want to have a conversation. The book was inspired by the fact that my apartment in Chicago, where we used to live, was across the street from an elementary school, and I was watching these children. I think they must have been in kindergarten. They looked so
Mhm.
young to me. Do this dystopian shooting drill, and I was thinking about how what does it say about us as a country that this is our response to this. And so I always view books, to me when I write books, I want them to be conversation starters. They are not answers. If I had the answer, I would take out a billboard and I would put it up. It's more this idea of wanting to build community for young people to ask the questions they have and then to come up with the answers. And so for me, it's a book that's asking the question of, what climate do we have that's causing people to behave in this violent way? What does that mean? How do we heal as a community? How do we move forward as a community? Um, and what does it mean to be a young person who's growing up in a country where this can happen to you when you go to school? Like what is a safe space now? And so, um, yeah, I love the idea, because I find when I get to go and talk with young people that they have so many ideas and they
Mhm.
also have so many questions about the community. And so my biggest thing is that I like to write stories that give them the opportunity to then engage with one another in that way and have that space to think deeply. Because when I was a young person, my favorite things about books were books that, like I talked about before, challenged my worldview.
Mhm.
I remember when I was in high school and I read White Teeth for the first time by Zadie Smith
Mhm.
and seeing people on the page that I had never seen star in a novel and what that meant to me. And so this question of who gets to tell the story and who gets to be a hero. So I think that um, it's a very different book than Other Words for Home, but I think
Mhm.
it is equally interested in ideas of social justice and empowering young people um, to feel like they have a stake in their communities and that their voice matters. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that I didn't understand when I was young how
Mhm.
important my voice was, and how important it was to protect my voice. And that's the biggest thing that I love to stress to young people, especially young girls.
Thank you for that. And I think that's kind of one of the things that has been really fascinating to watch during this time as we're all stuck at home, is seeing a lot more youth voices actually being amplified across social media, which I think is absolutely wonderful. But I'd love for you to share maybe a few ideas for young girls listening who are trying to get into writing and trying to get into storytelling in general.
Yeah, well, my number one advice always to anyone who wants to be a writer is read. Read as much as you can. Reading is the best apprenticeship for writing. I actually think of myself as a reader before I think of myself as a writer. And it's such an important part of my job, because when you're a writer, you are engaging in this conversation. And in order to be a good conversationalist, you need to know what has already been said and what is being said. And so I think reading also gives you such a great, you internalize this idea of what is an effective sentence, what
Mhm.
is an effective form for storytelling, or what isn't. And so read as much as you can, read outside of your genre, and then practice. So writing is a craft, and everyone starts out not being good at it. I was terrible. My first drafts are still terrible. Writing is rewriting, and I think sometimes when you're a young person, you're frustrated because you're going to compare your work to what you see in
Mhm.
a published book, and that's so detrimental. And it's something that I did. I was like, oh well, I'll never be good enough because what I'm writing is nowhere close to this. And the truth of the matter is what I'm writing still is nowhere close to this. It's months and months of revision that get you there. And also, I have a professional editor now. So I think there's help on that side. So I think just practicing and devoting yourself to your craft. I think sometimes we romanticize creative art. Um, but it's work, and it's important to do the work, and to set the time to do the work. There's like this inspiration idea, but inspiration doesn't find you unless you sit down at your chair and you write and you work. So my biggest advice, I guess, to young girls is to do the work, to do the work. And if you do the work, the results will come.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I think that applies not only to writing, but to anything you're trying to pursue in life, right? You have to do the work. And I think if you put in that legwork, though, things will work out, which is what's so wonderful about it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So I know you talked a little bit about the role your parents played in shaping the value of education in your household and also the value of education you now believe in. Could you talk a little bit about their influence on you and how that's kind of translated over into both your writing and maybe your parenting as well?
Yeah, so my father is Palestinian Jordanian, and he comes from a refugee Palestinian family. And I think that education changed the entire course of his own life, and that he in Jordan, there's an exam that you take when you're graduating from high school that sort of prescribes your whole future, and that it tells you what you can major in if you're going to go to a state university. And I know he felt so much pressure to get this score to be able to be a doctor because that was able to then uplift his entire family. And so I grew up with this whole narrative that my bedroom in the suburban Ohio house we were growing up in was twice as large as the whole apartment that his family had grown up in. And so I always had this idea that education had changed the
Power, yeah.
yeah, the whole dynamic of my family. And felt a lot of pressure in this regard to take school seriously and recognize that this was a gift and an opportunity that I'd been given that lots of my ancestors had not been given. This opportunity. I mean, I say that a lot when it comes to storytelling too, that I'm the first, I think, storyteller in my family to have any type of platform,
Mhm.
but definitely not the first storyteller in my family, and definitely not the first person with a story to tell. And so I think that this idea of recognizing my family history and the struggle that a lot of my ancestors had definitely shaped and informed my childhood, and does now, even when I talk to my kids about things that we just take for granted. I mean, this is so silly, but growing up, I loved taking bubble baths. And I remember my dad would always be like, "You use more water than the entire country of Jordan." Um, but just those things that I grew up with this understanding that my life was very different than even other people in my family. The opportunities that I've been given, and now that I've been given this window into publishing, I take very seriously that. I have a platform that lots of people from my background, from my cultural background, from my religious background, are not given, and I take that responsibility seriously and want to use it in the best way that I can to, again, change this narrative and write different narratives. And I'm always looking for other voices of other young women to uplift, because I think we need so many more. The thing that I worry about sometimes is like tokenism in
Mhm.
publishing, and that there will just be one voice or one narrative that then becomes the voice of this community, and that's not how our communities are. Our communities are not monolith, and I want lots of voices, and I want messy voices, and I want to be able to have a dialogue within our community. And so that's what I'm always looking for, is the next voice that we can uplift, the next story that we can tell. But yeah, sorry, I kind of got sidetracked, but I definitely think that my parents' value of education,
Mhm.
and also their my family's love of storytelling. Those two things, I see them in myself.
Mhm.
And I don't think I understood as a young person how that was creating this, but it definitely did. And I think, again, I was raised with books in my house. My mom read to me every night, and that's something that I feel really passionate about. I do with my own kids, instilling this love of storytelling and instilling this idea that the stories that we tell about one another matter, and there's power in that. Because if the only access point you have to a group of people is through media or through a narrative that's told about them, that narrative becomes so important of what you think about that community or know about that community.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can totally relate. I know growing up, I grew up in Egypt and I was surrounded by all these Muslim women who were like super powerful, super impassioned, super driven. And then when I moved here to the US, I found that suddenly the narrative has shifted. Like everything I saw in the media about Muslim women was that they were victimized, oppressed, voiceless agents. And so I think, and that disconnect is kind of what got me into activism in the first place. And I think that's often the catalyzer for so many youth, because it's like seeing that there is a narrative being told that you don't prescribe to and that doesn't fit your reality. And so learning how to fight back against that. So finally, I would like to ask you, um, what is kind of like your favorite book, and what do you think you've learned from that book and from reading? And I know that's a very hard question, I'm sure, especially for a writer, but I would love to hear about like how that book has helped you amplify the voices of others.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's my favorite book. Oh, that's really hard. My favorite book in recent memory that I read as an adult is this book called Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I think the book resonated with me so much just because it's this immigrant story, but it's also a story of a woman finding her own power and her own voice and the messiness of what you were talking about, because this book talks a lot about how she was born in Nigeria and her experience of being Black in Nigeria is very different than her experience of being Black in America. And this idea that our communities are also diverse within one another. And I think the book just did such a beautiful job, again, of complicating narratives. And also for me, as an outsider into these communities, I learned a lot. I was given a lot of vocabulary from this book, and an education in a way into the American experience for some of my fellow women women of color, who I obviously can't understand that experience or haven't had that experience. And so, I think, again, the book also, what it taught me is it's such a beautiful book. It's like this very captivating love story, and it's so propulsive. And I think what I learned from that book, that I don't know if I've ever verbalized this until now, I really thought about it, but we can write important stories that challenge narratives about important things that are also propulsive, captivating, great stories, that those aren't in conflict with one another. It doesn't have to be dry because it's about important things, and it doesn't have to be, and just because it also has a romance or also has these elements of storytelling, um, doesn't make it fluffy or unimportant. Like those two things can coexist together. And I think that was such an important thing for me, because I think I've been unlearning, especially in my adulthood, a lot of internalized sort of misogyny I have about what kind of stories are important, because I think for a long time men have gotten to say that. So like stories about classically male things like war or something are considered to be literary, and then things that concern women more, like motherhood or relationships or the familiar home, are considered to be like fluffier women's fiction. I think we now are in a moment where we're challenging, like, why is that story more important than this story? And I think Americana in lots of ways was my awakening into that, because it was such an undeniably important and gorgeous book that also dealt with things that are so classically female. And I think that was so empowering for me to see when I was like a young woman, starting off on wanting to do this writing journey, was to connect those dots of being like, the types of books and stories that I want to tell are important, and my voice as a woman is important, and I can talk about all of these complicated things and also write about these other things, and they don't have to be in conflict with one another.
Thank you. I mean, I think we all know what we're doing this coming weekend. It's reading, right? And we have a long list of things to read, which is absolutely wonderful, because as you said, reading is the best, apprenticeship for writers, but also for storytellers. And so I look forward to hearing the voices of not only so many of the youth tuning in, but also yours in your story that's coming out next May. So thank you. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you, and happy birthday. This is so awesome. So
Thank you.